On the question of same-sex marriage, I have been thinking about this for quite a long time. As you know, this has already come to the Australian Parliament for one vote, and also there is another vote due in 2 or 3 weeks' time, assuming that legislation comes for a vote. So the judgment I took, having reflected on my own position, as this is a conscience vote, it was time to explain to the people of Brisbane who vote for me, and more broadly to people interested around the nation, the reasons for my change of position on this. And what is it in a nutshell? I believe that surely Australia has grown up enough in the year 2013 for the secular state to have its definition of marriage, religious institutions and the Christian church to have their definition of marriage, and for them each to be able to conduct their own ceremonies. That's it in a nutshell.
Can you tell us more about the person who has played a role in changing your mind?
Well, I've talked to lots and lots of people. No, I'm not going to go into individual details. But there's lots of people I've spoken to. As the local federal member here, my regular practice is of a Saturday to have mobile offices across the electorate. I talk to people. They come up. I can't point to a single mobile office in the last several months where someone hasn't come up to me, same-sex couple, and says, why can't we get married? And it's been quite pervasive on the ground, but in particular people who are of a Christian background coming to me and saying, look, we have decided that we want to get married. What's your position on same-sex marriage? And so I've thought about all this long and hard. I've reflected on it. But I would draw all of your attention to the 2,000 words I've written on my blog site on this. And when you're next having a cup of coffee as hard-working journalists, sit down, have a read of it. And I'd say this to anybody around the country who's either supportive of my position or hotly opposed to it. Have a read of it because it tries to explain in some detail why I have landed the position I have just described.
It's a lot easier to make this decision.
I'll take these in sequence, yeah.
Why did you choose to make the announcement now? Is it not taking attention off the Prime Minister's campaign?
We have a vote in the House of Representatives on this in 2 to 3 weeks' time. For me to have said anything prior to the budget would have been wrong because it would have taken focus off the budget. And immediately after the budget, when you are dealing with the sell of the budget by government ministers around the country, I think that would have been wrong as well. So I've waited, frankly, for a bit of a lull. And also, given that we've got a vote coming up and the debate's about to heat up soon, I have an obligation as a Member of Parliament to explain to people what position I will take to that vote and why. And that's why I've chosen to do it in my own timing and, most importantly, in my own words.
What do you think about gay couples becoming parents?
Well, as you know, the state laws of Australia, both state and territory, already have a number of items of legislation which deal with this. First of all, you have a majority of states and territories which have already laws in place which permit various forms of surrogacy. Secondly, you also have in place laws which allow for adoption and I think in some cases fostering, and these are the provinces of the states. Secondly, I'm just saying these are laws already in place by the states. Furthermore, in terms of family law recognition of children's rights who are being brought up in these relationships, that was already dealt with the changes we made in the Federal Parliament when then Attorney General Robert McClelland undertook a series, in fact 87 changes to Commonwealth statutes on this matter some years ago. What this does in terms of same-sex marriage is try to close that remaining gap. And also, as I say in the article, to provide same-sex parents who have kids with the option, the possibility of providing long-term public pledge of commitment and, if they so choose, the basis of emotional stability and continuity that can provide kids who are in that relationship. And by the way, there are 30,000 or 40,000 kids in Australia who are currently being brought up in such relationships. I think you had a question, didn't you, mate?
You seem like you've become a very strong convert to this stance. Isn't it just a convenience that you take this stance as a backbencher rather than in a leadership role, both as an opposition leader and a Prime Minister? And do you concede that it's easier to take this position as a backbencher? And did you ever hold this position or even close to this position?
Well, Michael, as I say in the article, and I'm sure you've read it and memorised it by now, Whenever I would come out with a change in position on this matter, and something is so controversial across the country as same-sex marriage, people are going to say, well, why did you do it then and not another time? And you'll get criticised for whenever you do that. Secondly, to thine own self be true. And as your view evolves and changes, as mine has done over recent months, over the course of the last 12 months, then when it reaches conclusion, that's when you should put it into the public domain, and that's been my experience.
So what was the juncture?
And people will know very well from my multiple conversations with them on these matters, going back over quite a long period of time, as I say in the blog, and I draw your attention to it, that this has been something of a personal journey for me, and discussions with my family as well. As I say in the piece, I've been the last of the Mohicans on this one. Therese has had a view in support of same-sex marriage for some time. All three kids have, and they look at me as some family dinosaur. I think we're all shaped by the views of those immediately around us and by our wider network of friends, but also I've done a fair bit of reading. As you would also see from the article I've written, in my own words, over quite a number of weeks now, I've also looked at all the sociological surveys which have been done in the United States on the long-term impact of children being raised in same-sex relationships. And these are thorough studies, longitudinal studies underway since the late 80s and early 90s. And their collective finding is that there is no evidentiary basis to suggest that kids who are brought up in such relationships are any worse off than those brought up in other relationships with opposite-sex parents.
Mr. Ruddy, you understand that this puts you at odds with Julia Gillard. Will you discuss the issue?
I said in the article this morning, I don't intend to become some national campaigner on this question. My responsibility is to make my position clear to my community here in Brisbane and to others who have followed this debate across the nation.
You don't intend to try and sway her?
I was about to complete my answer to the question, which is to say each person arrives at their position on this as a matter of conscience. And that's been the case with me as well. And that has taken a period of time. I'm sure in the case of the Prime Minister, she's arrived at her position of opposition to same-sex marriage as a product of her own conscience and her own deliberations. So that's a matter for her. The important thing is that when this matter is next discussed, and now that we have the bloke who already thinks he's occupying the lodge, Tony Abbott, here in Queensland today, can I just suggest this? Just have the decency to extend a conscience vote to everybody. The Labor Party offers a conscience vote on these questions. Mr Abbott does not permit that of the Liberal Party. I don't think that is the proper way in which this matter, which affects people deeply and personally, and is complex ethically, let's just grant that point, it's not one where a party discipline should be imposed. Every member of Parliament should exercise their own conscience and be free to vote accordingly. So my challenge to Mr Abbott today is to give his own mob a conscience vote, and if you won't do that, then let's look at the possibility of a referendum as the best way to resolve that, as Tony Windsor has suggested before. Can I just take this question? I'll come back to you.
Sorry, the Australian Christian lobby has obviously criticised your decision today. They've said it.
Surprised by that criticism.
They've said it creates a stolen generation. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I respect the role that the Australian Christian lobby and Jim Wallace play in the public policy debate in Australia. Their views and Christian views opposed to same-sex marriage have every right to be heard across the nation as anyone else's views. I actually think there is a real time for some civility in the national debate on this. We seem to have missiles being thrown in each direction, either from Christian fundamentalists in one direction or from various parts of the gay lobby in the other direction. I think what the mood of the Australian nation is, how do we actually come together on this, and how do we find a way through? And what I've tried to do in the article I've written is to identify my prescription for what I think a way through is, which is a recognition, once again, that a secular state should have the powers to recognise married relationships, be they of opposite-sex couples or same-sex couples, and that religious institutions, on the other hand, including the Christian Church, should have complete legal protection to continue to conduct their ceremonies exclusively between men and women. I think that's the way through this, frankly, and I think there is a time for some civilised discussion about where we can find a way through rather than unnecessarily dividing the Australian society down the middle.
Critics will say this is more about your leadership ambitions, isn't it?
You know, critics will say 1,000 things. You know, next week I'll be responsible for the collapse of Western civilization. I'm sure last week I was responsible for a lunar eclipse somewhere.
But you said you waited for a lull. Is this more about your leadership ambitions?
Give us a break, you know. Had I spoken about this last week, I would have been disrupting the budget. The week before would have been preempting the budget and getting in the road. What's the bottom line here? There's a vote coming up in the Parliament. It's 2 to 3 weeks away. It's the right time to put this position out clearly and in my own terms, rather than have all you guys legitimately come around and ask us all those questions the night before the vote is taken. Well, what are you going to do this time and why? I'd much rather, with a bit of clear air, put it out there in my own language on a blog site so that people can read it. And for those who are critical of me, either in terms of motives or the conclusion that I've reached, I had one simple request for all members of Parliament, whether they're on my own side or whether they are part of the Liberal National Party, or independents for that matter, is just give the article a read and form your own conclusion whether you think it's reasonable or whether you think it's unreasonable. I think there is a time for some civility in this important debate for the nation.